A girl was humiliated for just asking to use the restroom, surrounded by cold, indifferent luxury. Between tears and contempt, she almost lost hope. But an unexpected gesture rekindled something that money can't buy. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. New York City was waking up once again to its frantic, merciless rhythm. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October when the heat mixed with the pollution to create that characteristic haze that seemed to swallow the downtown skyscrapers. The high-end shopping streets around Fifth Avenue were buzzing with hurried people, each one lost in their own problems, their cell phones, their private urgencies. No one paid attention to anyone else. It was like this every day, as if the city had forged a silent pact of indifference. Among that invisible crowd walked a little girl, only 5 years old. Her name was Isabella, but few people knew that. To most of the people who crossed her path daily, she was just another street kid, a social problem they preferred not to see. Isabella had tangled brown hair that fell over her thin shoulders, large, expressive eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for her age, and a faded pink dress that had belonged to another child before it came to her. Her rubber flip-flops were worn out, with holes in some spots, barely protecting her small feet from the hot asphalt. That morning, Isabella had woken up early at Ms. Carmen's place, a 62-year-old woman who had taken her in a few months ago. Carmen wasn't her grandmother or her aunt or any relation to the girl at all. She was just a kind woman who had worked her whole life as a housekeeper and who, upon retiring with an insufficient minimum wage pension, still found room in her heart and in her small apartment in a housing project in the Bronx to shelter this abandoned child. Miss Carmen was sick, with swollen legs and fragile health, but she never complained. She always said that God had a plan and that taking care of Isabella was a sacred mission. Isabella didn't know exactly where she came from. Her earliest memories were hazy, fragmented like a bad dream she was trying to wake up from. She vaguely remembered a woman who smelled of cheap perfume and who would leave her alone for days on end. Then she remembered being on the street, cold, until Ms. Carmen appeared and took her home. That was all the girl needed to know for now. The present was already hard enough without having to carry the weight of the past. Every morning, Isabella would go out and walk the streets of downtown Manhattan. Ms. Carmen didn't like it, but the girl insisted. She said she needed to help, that she couldn't just sit around while the old woman was feeling sick. So, with Carmen's reluctant permission, Isabella would walk for miles, watching people, learning about this world that had rejected her before it even knew her. She didn't beg for money. She had too much pride for that. She just walked, observed, and sometimes when a kind person offered, she would accept a piece of bread, a piece of fruit, a cup of water. But on that particular Tuesday, Isabella faced a different problem. She had drunk too much water that morning, and after walking for more than 2 hours under the hot sun, her small body was signaling an urgency that could no longer be ignored. She needed to use a bathroom, and she needed to find one fast. She looked around, seeing the elegant stores, the imposing department stores, the sophisticated restaurants. She knew she wouldn't be welcome in any of those places, but her need was greater than her fear of rejection. It was then that Isabella saw a designer clothing store with huge display windows showcasing mannequins dressed in clothes that cost more than Ms. Carmen earned in an entire year. The store was called Elegance Boulevard and had a mirrored glass facade that reflected the bustling street. Isabella took a deep breath, gathered all the courage she had in her tiny body, and pushed through the revolving door. The contrast was immediate and jarring. From the suffocating heat of the street, Isabella entered a space with ice-cold air conditioning that instantly gave her goosebumps. The floor was polished white marble, so clean she could see her distorted reflection. The lights were bright, aimed at the racks of outrageously expensive clothes. Soft music played in the background, a kind of sound Isabella had never heard before. Everything in there breathed luxury, exclusivity, a world completely different from her own. The first to notice her presence were the security guards. 2 large men in black suits who immediately exchanged glances with expressions that mixed surprise and disapproval. Then the saleswomen stopped what they were doing. There were 3 impeccably dressed women, with perfect makeup and smiles that vanished as soon as they saw Isabella. The few customers in the store also noticed the girl's presence, and an uncomfortable silence fell for a few seconds. Isabella felt all those dozens of eyes on her. She felt the weight of judgment, of silent disapproval, of the unspoken question hanging in the air. What was a child like that doing in here? But she didn't have time to be intimidated. The urgency in her body was real and growing. With small, timid steps, she approached the main counter, where one of the saleswomen was watching her with her arms crossed. The woman looked to be about 35, with bleached blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, long red nails, and an expression of superiority etched on her face. Her name tag said Patricia, but Isabella couldn't read yet. The girl stopped in front of the counter, which was too high for her, and had to crane her neck to look into the saleswoman's eyes. In the most polite voice she could manage, Isabella said, "Please, Mom, can I use the bathroom? It'll just be for a second, I promise." Patricia looked at the girl as if she had asked to rob the cash register. Her nose wrinkled slightly, as if she had smelled something bad. She didn't answer right away, just continued to stare Isabella up and down, analyzing every detail of her worn clothes, her dirty feet in the old flip-flops, her tangled hair. "The restroom is for customers only," the saleswoman finally replied, her voice cold and mechanical, without a trace of empathy. Isabella felt tears start to well up in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. "I really have to. Go, please. I won't take long, I won't make a mess, I promise." The girl's voice came out shaky, filled with genuine desperation. It was at that moment that the store manager approached. His name was Robert Miller, a 42-year-old man, thin with a pencil mustache and a permanently irritated look on his face. He wore an impeccable grey suit and a navy blue tie, and he prided himself on running this designer store with an iron fist. For Robert, every detail mattered. The flawless appearance of the store, the profile of the clientele, the maintenance of an image of exclusivity. And this dirty, ragged child was everything he didn't want inside. "What's the problem here?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Patricia pointed at Isabella with disdain. "She wants to use our restroom." Robert looked at Isabella with an expression the girl would never forget. It was a vacant look, devoid of any humanity. He didn't see a child. He didn't see a human being in a vulnerable situation. He saw only a problem, a nuisance, something that needed to be removed as quickly as possible. "You're not a customer here," he said in a harsh voice. "Our restroom is for people who buy things, for people who can afford to be in this store. Do you understand that?" Isabella shook her head, confused. "But I just need to use the bathroom. I won't break anything." Robert's face hardened even more. "Look, kid, I'm going to be clear with you. People like you can't just come in here and use our facilities. You'll get everything dirty. You'll scare away our real customers. This is not a place for you. You need to leave now." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. She felt the tears finally escape and roll down her cheeks. She tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. She just stood there, her body trembling, as she felt everyone in the store watching this humiliating scene. Robert, impatient, took a step forward and pointed to the door. "I said get out, now, before I call security." Isabella took a few steps back, stumbling over her own feet. The tears were now falling freely, and she no longer tried to hide them. Some customers watched the scene with uncomfortable expressions, but no one said a word. An elderly woman looked away, feigning interest in a blouse on a rack. A young couple whispered something to each other but didn't intervene either. The collective indifference was as painful as the direct humiliation. With a broken heart and her body shaking with shame and physical need, Isabella ran to the door, pushing it open with all her might and leaving that place that had made her feel smaller than ever. Once on the sidewalk, she leaned against the wall next to the store and began to cry for real, sobbing loudly, her whole body shaking. What Isabella didn't know was that from the back of the store someone had witnessed the entire scene. Someone who had been trying on clothes in the fitting room and who, upon hearing the argument, had quietly stepped out to observe. That someone was a 53-year-old man named Edward Price. Edward was no ordinary man. He was one of the most successful businessmen in the country, the owner of a chain of luxury hotels that spanned the nation. His fortune was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. He moved in the most exclusive circles of New York society, dined with politicians, and closed multi-million-dollar deals in meetings that lasted only a few minutes. Edward Price was used to having everything, to commanding everyone, to never hearing the word no. But at that moment, wearing expensive dress pants and a white shirt that cost more than many families make in a month, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years. A deep pain in his chest, a lump in his throat, a visceral shame that made him want to disappear. He had seen everything. The girl's polite request, the saleswoman's cold refusal, the manager's unnecessary cruelty, the public humiliation, the cowardly expulsion of a 5-year-old child who just needed to use a bathroom. Edward had watched the whole scene unfold as if he were watching a horror movie, unable to look away. And the worst part was that he recognized himself in those people. For years, Edward had built his empire with cold, calculated, often cruel decisions. He had fired employees without a second thought for their families, signed contracts that ruined small business owners, and prioritized profit above any human consideration. Edward had always justified his actions as necessary in the business world, but now, seeing that child crying outside the store, he realized he had become exactly like that manager. Someone incapable of seeing the humanity in others. Without a second thought, Edward dropped the clothes he was trying on and walked to the front of the store. Some employees looked at him in surprise. After all, he hadn't paid yet. But Edward didn't care. At that moment, nothing mattered more than the girl crying on the sidewalk. When Edward stepped out onto the street, he saw Isabella leaning against the wall, her face hidden in her small hands, her body shaking with sobs. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her further. He knelt beside her, bringing himself to her level. "Hey, little one," he said in a soft voice, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. "Are you okay?" Isabella lifted her face, revealing eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked at Edward with suspicion, that self-preservation instinct that street kids develop far too early. "I'm not going to hurt you," Edward continued. "I saw what happened in there. It was very unfair to you. Very unfair." Isabella sniffled and wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I just wanted to use the bathroom," she said in a choked voice. "I wasn't going to ruin anything. I just really had to go." "I know," Edward replied, feeling his heart ache even more. "And you did nothing wrong. The people in there were very wrong to you. What's your name?" "Isabella," the girl answered, still wary, but starting to let her guard down in the face of the genuine kindness in this man's eyes. "Isabella, what a beautiful name," Edward smiled. "Look, I'm going to help you, okay? First, let's take care of your urgent problem. There's a cafe across the street where I know the owner. Let's go there and you can use the bathroom as much as you want without anyone treating you badly. How does that sound?" Isabella looked at the man, trying to decide if she could trust him. There was something in his eyes, a sincerity she rarely saw in adults. She nodded her head shyly. Edward stood up and held out his hand to her. Isabella hesitated for a moment before placing her small, dirty hand in his large, well-kept one. Together, they started walking down the busy sidewalk. As they walked, Edward asked gentle questions. He found out that Isabella lived with Miss Carmen, that she walked the streets every day, that she didn't go to school because she didn't have any official documents. The girl spoke in bits and pieces, still cautious, but there was a clear need in her to be heard, to be seen as someone who mattered. They arrived at the cafe, a small but cozy establishment called John's Corner Cafe. Edward was indeed known there, and the owner, John Baker, a 60-year-old man with a prominent belly and a warm smile, greeted him effusively. "Ms. Isabella here needs to use the restroom," Edward said firmly but gently. "And after that, if you could, a really nice snack for her." John looked at the girl and his face filled with genuine compassion. "Of course, sweetie, come with me. The bathroom is spotless and you can take as long as you need." Isabella looked at Edward, seeking confirmation. He nodded encouragingly. "Go on, we'll talk more later." The girl followed John to the back of the cafe, and Edward sat at a table near the window. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to just sit and think, with no phone in his hand, no meetings scheduled, no business pressures. And as he thought, a plan began to form in his mind. He wasn't going to let this situation slide. He wasn't going to let that arrogant manager and that cruel saleswoman continue to treat vulnerable people that way. But more than that, Edward realized he couldn't just fix this and go back to his life of luxury, pretending everything was fine. Something had changed in him that morning. Something fundamental and irreversible. When Isabella came out of the bathroom, visibly relieved and with her face washed, she found Edward waiting at the table with a huge plate holding a grilled cheese sandwich, orange, juice, sliced fruit, and a piece of chocolate cake. "Sit here and eat as much as you want," Edward said, pulling out a chair for her. Isabella looked at the food with wide eyes. It was more food than she usually saw in several days. She looked at Edward, seeking permission again, still not believing it was all for her. "It's all yours," he confirmed with a smile. "Take your time." As Isabella ate, Edward watched her every move. The way she savored each bite of the sandwich as if it were the most precious food in the world. The delicacy with which she drank the juice, trying not to spill. The expression of pure joy when she tasted the chocolate cake. It all broke and rebuilt Edward's heart at the same time. "Isabella," Edward began after she was full, "I need to go back to that store. There's something I need to take care of there, but first tell me something. Would you like it if no one ever treated you that way again? If people respected you, saw you as you deserve to be seen?" The girl looked at him with those big, expressive eyes, processing the question. Then, with devastating sincerity, she replied, "Everyone always looks at me like I'm dirty, like I'm no good. Miss Carmen says I'm special, but nobody out there treats me like that. It would be really nice if people were kind like you and Mr. John." Edward felt tears burn his eyes, something that hadn't happened in decades. He cleared his throat and said, "Then I'm going to do something for you. I'm going to show those people that they were completely wrong. And I'm going to make sure they understand it. Do you trust me?" Isabella thought for a moment, and then nodded. She didn't fully understand what Edward was planning, but something inside her told her this man was different, that he really cared. "Great," Edward said, standing up and holding out his hand to her again. "Then let's go back to that store. But this time you're going to walk in through the front door with your head held high, and you're going to be treated with all the respect you deserve. I promise." Isabella took his hand, and together they left the cafe. John waved to them from the door, a warm smile on his face, happy to have been part of this small transformation. As they walked back to Elegance Boulevard, Edward felt a mix of anger and determination. He didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but he knew he wasn't going to let it go. The cold, calculating businessman was giving way to something he didn't recognize in himself, a sense of justice, a need to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. When they arrived in front of the store, Edward stopped and knelt again to be at Isabella's level. "Remember what I said, you deserve respect, it doesn't matter what these people say or think. You are important, you have value. Are you ready?" Isabella, still holding Edward's hand tightly, took a deep breath and nodded. For the first time that terrible morning, she felt something other than shame and fear. She felt hope. And that, she would soon discover, was the beginning of a change that would affect many more people than she could ever imagine. Edward pushed through the revolving door of Elegance Boulevard with Isabella by his side, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. He didn't enter as a discreet customer trying on clothes. He entered as a man on a mission, with an upright posture, a firm gaze, and a determination that radiated from every pore of his body. Isabella, holding his hand, felt that energy and walked with a little more confidence, though her little heart was still pounding. The same employees who had witnessed the humiliation minutes earlier now looked at the pair with confused expressions. The saleswoman, Patricia, dropped a blouse she was folding. One of the security guards took a step forward, but something in Edward's demeanor made him hesitate. The manager, Robert, who was at the back of the store organizing the cash register, heard the door chime and looked up, his face instantly turning pale as he recognized the girl he had just kicked out. Edward walked directly to the main counter with Isabella at his side. His voice came out clear, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. but controlled without shouting or losing his temper. "I need to speak with the manager. Now." Robert swallowed hard and approached, trying to maintain his authoritative posture, but already sensing that something was very wrong. The expression on this elegant man's face was not that of an ordinary customer. It was that of someone used to being obeyed. "Yes, sir, how can I help you?" Robert said, forcing a professional smile that didn't come close to reaching his eyes. Edward pointed to Isabella. "This girl was here a few minutes ago. She politely asked to use the restroom. She was humiliated, insulted, and thrown out by you. Do you remember that, or do I need to refresh your memory?" The silence that fell over the store was absolute. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. Patricia and the other saleswomen stared at the scene, unsure how to react. The few customers in the store, including the elderly woman who had looked away before, were now watching with rapt attention. Robert tried to compose himself, his arrogance returning for a moment. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but we have rules in this establishment. Our restroom is for customers and the girl is not a customer. I was simply following store protocol." "Protocol?" Edward repeated, his voice laced with disdain. "You call humiliating a 5-year-old child who had an urgent need protocol? You call telling her that people like her will get the place dirty protocol? That this isn't a space for her? Is that protocol or is it just pure cruelty?" Robert took a step back, his confidence beginning to crumble. "I was protecting the interests of the store and our real customers. You don't understand. We have to maintain a certain standard here." "Standard?" Edward practically spat the word. "Your standard is to measure a human being's worth by the clothes they wear. A 5-year-old child who only wanted to use a bathroom was deemed unworthy of being treated with the bare minimum of human decency because of her appearance." At that moment, one of the saleswomen, an older woman named Sandra who had worked at the store for nearly 10 years, stepped forward. Her voice was shaky but firm. "Excuse me for interrupting, but I thought it was very wrong too. I wanted to say something at the time, but I was afraid of losing my job. The girl was clearly desperate, and what Mr. Miller did was cruel." Robert turned to Sandra, his eyes bloodshot with rage. "You're fired! How dare you question my decisions in front of customers?" "Actually," Edward interrupted, his voice now lower but infinitely more threatening, "I'll be the one making decisions about who gets fired around here. Because you see, I'm not just a customer. I'm Edward Price, and I happen to own a hotel chain that has a uniform supply contract with this store's parent company, a contract worth several $1,000,000 a year." The effect was immediate. Robert's face went from red with anger to white with terror in a matter of seconds. Patricia let out a small, muffled gasp. Even the security guards seemed to stand at greater attention, realizing they were in the presence of someone truly powerful. "Mr. Price," Robert stammered, all his arrogance evaporating, "I didn't know. I had no idea who you were. If I had known—" "If you had known, you would have treated me differently," Edward finished the sentence. "But you would have treated this little girl the same horrible way, wouldn't you? Because the problem isn't who I am, the problem is who you are. A person who measures the worth of others by their bank account." Edward turned to Isabella, who was watching everything with wide eyes, trying to understand this adult world of power and confrontation. He knelt again and spoke to her. "Isabella, I want you to use this store's bathroom, not because I'm telling you to, but because you have every right to. Because you are a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity. Do you want to do that?" The girl looked at the restroom door at the back of the store, then at Robert, who now looked terrified, then back at Edward. She nodded her head shyly. "Excellent." Edward smiled and stood up, looking directly at Robert. "You will escort Isabella to the restroom. You will wait for her to finish, and you will ensure she has everything she needs, toilet paper, soap, a clean towel, and you will do it with respect and kindness, understood?" Robert opened and closed his mouth a few times, looking like a fish out of water, before finally nodding. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." "And after she comes out," Edward continued, "you will apologize to her. A real apology, not one of those empty ones people give when they're afraid of losing their job. You will look her in the eye, and you will acknowledge that what you did was wrong." Robert swallowed hard and nodded again. Yes, Mr. Price. Isabella followed Robert to the restroom, and Edward remained in the store, observing the reactions of the other people. Sandra, the saleswoman who had spoken up, had tears in her eyes. A young customer who had watched everything approached Edward. "Thank you for doing that," she said quietly. "I saw everything that happened before, and I felt so ashamed for not doing anything. You're very brave." "It's not bravery," Edward replied, his voice filled with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "It's just doing what's right, something we should all do, always." While they waited, Edward took the opportunity to speak with the other employees. He discovered that many of them had witnessed similar situations, where vulnerable people were treated with contempt. Sandra told him she had seen Robert kick out homeless people, construction workers covered in cement dust, and even elderly people he considered poorly dressed. The culture of that store, she explained, was one of exclusion disguised as exclusivity. When Isabella came out of the restroom, looking relieved and with clean hands, Robert was by her side with a miserable expression on his face. Edward waited for him to keep his promise. Robert knelt before Isabella, and for the first time since Edward had met him, he seemed genuinely human. "Isabella," he began, and his voice trembled slightly, "I want to apologize for the way I treated you. I had no right to talk to you like that, to make you feel bad, to kick you out. You did nothing wrong. I was very rude and cruel. I'm truly sorry." Isabella looked at him for a long moment, processing his words. Edward watched intently, wanting to see if the girl would accept the apology. Finally, Isabella shrugged and said, "It's okay, just don't do it to other kids." The simplicity and wisdom of that response left everyone speechless. A 5-year-old child, who had been humiliated and mistreated, was teaching compassion and forgiveness to an adult who should have known better. Edward took Isabella's hand again and headed for the exit. Before leaving, he turned to Robert one last time. "I will be in contact with the owners of this store," he said, "not to have you fired, but to have you properly trained on how to treat all people with respect, regardless of their appearance or social standing. And if I hear that anything like this has happened, here again the consequences will be much more serious." To Sandra he nodded. "You're not fired. In fact, I'm going to recommend you for a promotion for having the courage to speak up." As they left the store, Edward and Isabella walked in silence for a few minutes. The girl seemed to be processing everything that had happened, trying to understand this complex adult world where things could change so quickly. "Mr. Edward," Isabella finally said, "why did you do all that for me? You don't even know me." Edward stopped walking and knelt for the third time that transformative morning. "Because I saw something in you that I had forgotten existed," he answered with brutal honesty. "I saw dignity, courage, and kindness, and I saw that the world was treating you horribly, and I realized that I'm part of that world, that I helped create this world where people are judged by what they have, not by who they are, and I don't want to be a part of that anymore." Isabella tilted her head, trying to understand such deep words. "You're rich, right?" "I am," Edward admitted. "Very rich." "Then you can help a lot of people like me," Isabella said with a childlike logic that was at once devastatingly simple and profoundly true. Edward felt something definitively break inside him. This 5-year-old girl, with all her innocence and suffering, was giving him a lesson that no MBA course, no business meeting, no expensive consultant had ever given him. She was showing him that wealth without humanity was empty. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can help a lot of people, and I'm going to start by helping you and Ms. Carmen. Tell me more about where you live, how you live." Isabella, now more at ease with Edward, began to share details of her life. She talked about the rundown apartment in the Bronx, about how Ms. Carmen made crafts to sell but could barely manage because her hands hurt so much, about how sometimes there wasn't enough food and they had to ask neighbors for help, about how hard it was to sleep when it rained because the roof leaked. With each detail, Edward felt his heart break a little more. He lived in a 5,000-square-foot penthouse in one of the most luxurious buildings in Manhattan, had 3 imported cars in his garage, and spent more on a single dinner than those two went hungry for in a month. And never, in all his years of success, had he stopped to think about the reality of the people living just a few miles away from his ivory tower. "Isabella," Edward said after she finished her story, "I want to meet Ms. Carmen. Do you think she would let me visit you?" The girl thought for a moment. "Ms. Carmen is very proud. She doesn't like to accept help. But she's good, you know. She gave me a home when no one else. Edward, I think she'd like to meet you." Edward looked at his expensive watch, a Rolex that cost more than many people earned in years. He had an important meeting scheduled for that afternoon, a multi-million-dollar negotiation to expand his hotel chain into the Midwest. But at that moment, looking at Isabella, he realized that meeting could wait. Or rather, that it simply wasn't as important as he had always thought it was. If you were in Edward's shoes, would you drop everything to help Isabella and Ms. Carmen? Or would you go back to your normal life? Let us know in the comments. Then let's go, Edward decided. Take me to your home. I want to meet Ms. Carmen and understand better how I can help you. Isabella smiled, a genuine, beautiful smile that lit up her small face. She took Edward's hand and began to lead him down the street, heading towards the nearest bus stop. "We're taking the bus?" Edward asked, realizing where they were headed. "Yeah," Isabella replied naturally. "It's far, but the bus goes straight there." Edward looked around and saw his private driver, Wilson, parked across the street, waiting patiently as he always did. He could call Wilson and they could go comfortably in the air-conditioned car. But something stopped him. He wanted to experience Isabella's world, to understand what it was like to live without the bubble of privilege in which he had always floated. "All right," he said. "Let's take the bus then." They boarded the crowded bus, where Edward experienced for the first time in decades the feeling of being squeezed between other people, feeling the collective heat, hearing the everyday conversations, seeing the raw reality of the city he thought he knew. Isabella, used to it, held on tight to the handrail and chatted with Edward about simple things, the colors of the buildings they passed, the dogs she saw on the streets, the people she knew along the way. After almost an hour, they got off in a neighborhood Edward had never visited. The streets were cracked pavement. The buildings were a mix of brick and concrete. Children played barefoot on the sidewalk, and adults chatted on makeshift stoops. It was a world completely different from his, but there was life here. Community, human connections that Edward had long since lost in his exclusive circles. Isabella led him through narrow walkways between buildings until they reached a small apartment with a faded blue door. The door was ajar, and a weak voice came from inside. "Isabella, is that you, honey? Where have you been? I was worried." "I'm here, Miss Carmen," Isabella answered, walking in. "And I brought a friend." Edward followed her inside and found himself in a tiny space that served as a kitchen, living room and bedroom all at once. The walls were old plaster. The floor was cracked linoleum. There was just an old bed in one corner, a small stove, and a few shelves with very few utensils. But despite the extreme poverty, everything was clean and organized. There were flowers in a coffee can turned into a vase. The clothes were washed and folded. It was a home, small and precarious, but a home. Miss Carmen was sitting on the bed, her swollen legs propped up on a makeshift pillow. She had grey hair tied in a bun, a wrinkled face, but still bright eyes, and she wore a simple but clean dress. When she saw Edward, her expression filled with suspicion and concern. "Who is this man, Isabella?" Miss Carmen asked, her voice protective. Edward introduced himself respectfully. "Miss Carmen, my name is Edward. I met Isabella this morning and I came here because I'd like to talk with you, if you'll allow me." Miss Carmen studied Edward for a long moment, her experienced eyes taking in every detail, the expensive clothes, the designer watch, the posture of someone accustomed to privilege. Finally, she said, "What does a rich man like you want with us? If you've come to offer a handout, you can leave. We may be poor, but we have our dignity." Edward felt immense respect for this woman who, even in such precarious conditions, maintained her dignity intact. "I didn't come to offer a handout, Miss Carmen. I came because I witnessed Isabella being treated horribly today, and it touched me in a way I can't explain. And I came because I think I can help, not out of pity, but because it's the right thing to do." Miss Carmen relaxed a little, but still maintained her cautious posture. "Sit then. Sorry I don't have anything to offer you." Edward sat in the only available chair, while Isabella settled at Miss Carmen's feet. For the next hour they talked. Ms. Carmen told her story. She had worked for 40 years as a housekeeper, raised 3 children alone after her husband abandoned them, never managed to save money because she always sent everything to her kids, and now lived on a miserable pension. Her children had grown up and gone their own ways, rarely keeping in touch. When she found Isabella abandoned on the street, she didn't think twice about taking the girl in, even knowing she could barely support herself. Edward listened to it all in silence, and with every word, his admiration for this woman grew. Miss Carmen was neither a victim nor a martyr. She was a survivor, a quiet warrior who faced life with dignity and love, even when life gave her every reason to give up. "Miss Carmen," Edward finally said, "I want to truly help you. I'm not talking about giving you some money and leaving. I'm talking about ensuring you have what you need, a decent home, food, healthcare for you, school for Isabella. I have the resources for this, and I want to use those resources in a way that really makes a difference." Miss Carmen studied him again. "And what do you want in return? In my experience, rich people don't do anything for free." Edward took a deep breath. "I don't want anything in return, Miss Carmen. But I'll be honest with you. I need this as much as you do. I've built a life of wealth, but it's empty of meaning. I've become a person I don't like who only thinks about money and power. Meeting Isabella today made me realize that I need to change, and helping you is the beginning of that change." For the first time, Miss Carmen smiled. It was a small but genuine smile. "You're a strange one, Mr. Edward, but I see sincerity in your eyes. All right, we'll accept your help, but on one condition. We don't want to become your charity project. We want dignity, respect. If you can give us that, then we can accept." Edward extended his hand to her. "It's a deal, Miss Carmen." They shook hands, and at that moment, without either of them knowing it, a transformation began that would go far beyond the three of them. It was the beginning of something bigger, deeper, that would question privilege, prejudice, and the very structure of a society that had normalized inequality. The days that followed that transformative encounter were a whirlwind in the lives of everyone involved. Edward didn't simply return to his usual routine. He couldn't. Something in him had changed irreversibly, as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes, and now he saw the world with a painful clarity that could no longer be ignored. The morning after meeting Miss Carmen and Isabella, Edward cancelled all his meetings. His assistant, Marcia, an efficient 40-year-old woman who had worked with him for over a decade, was shocked. "Mr. Price, the meeting with the Japanese. Her investors is crucial. They flew in from Tokyo specifically for this. We can't just cancel." Edward looked at her with an expression Marcia had never seen before, a mix of determination and something akin to peace. "Cancel it, Marcia, or better yet, reschedule for next week. I have more important things to do right now." Marcia blinked several times, processing his words. In all her years working for Edward, she had never heard him say that anything was more important than business. But she knew her boss well enough to know there was no point in arguing when he had that look on his face. Edward spent the following days immersed in the reality of Isabella and Miss Carmen. He visited them daily, sometimes twice a day, bringing food, medicine, small comforts. But more than that, he listened. He listened to Miss Carmen's stories about her years of work, about the cruel employers and the rare generous ones, about raising children alone, about exhaustion and loneliness. He listened to Isabella talk about her simple childhood dreams. She wanted to learn to read, she wanted to have dolls, she wanted Miss Carmen's legs to stop hurting. It was during one of these visits, about a week after meeting them, that Edward received an unexpected call. It was from his daughter, Marina. They hadn't spoken in almost 6 months, since a terrible argument about Edward never having time for his family. "Dad," Marina's voice sounded surprised on the other end of the line. "Marcia told me you cancelled important meetings. Are you okay? Are you sick?" Edward felt a tightness in his chest. His own daughter thought it was impossible for him to cancel meetings for any reason other than illness. I'm fine, Marina. In fact, I'm better than I've been in years. Can we meet? I need to talk to you about something important. They arranged to meet that same afternoon at a cafe near Marina's apartment. When Edward arrived, he found his daughter already waiting. Marina was 32, a psychologist who worked at an NGO that served vulnerable children. She was beautiful like her mother, with long brown hair and eyes that always seemed to see through the masks people wore. She and Edward had grown distant over the years, especially after her mother, Beatrice, had passed away 5 years prior. Edward had thrown himself even deeper into his work after the loss, using business as a way to avoid dealing with his grief, and Marina had felt abandoned. "Hi, Dad," Marina said, kissing Edward's cheek. "You look different. I can't explain what it is, but there's something different about you." Edward smiled, a genuine smile that surprised them both. "A lot is different, Marina, and I need to tell you everything." For the next hour, Edward told her the whole story. The day at the store, Isabella's humiliation, his intervention, meeting Ms. Carmen, and how it had all turned his world upside down. Marina listened in silence, and Edward noticed there were tears in her eyes. When he finished, Marina was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "Dad, do you know what this story reminds me of? You. The real you. The one I knew when I was a kid, before you got lost in the business world." Edward felt Marina's words like both a blow and an embrace. "What do you mean?" Marina took her father's hand across the table. "You don't remember, but when I was 7, we were coming back from a restaurant and saw a family sleeping on the street. You stopped, bought food for all of them and talked with them for almost an hour. Mom kept saying we needed to go, but you insisted on hearing their story. I never forgot that day, Dad. It was the first time I understood what empathy was. You taught me that." Edward felt tears burn his eyes. He vaguely remembered that day, but it was like a memory from another life, of another person. "What happened to me, Marina? When did I become so cold?" Marina squeezed his hand tighter. "When you started to believe you were worth what you had, not who you were. When the numbers in your bank account became more important than people. When you stopped letting yourself feel, because feeling hurts, and it's easier to hide behind contracts and meetings." Marina's words were harsh, but Edward knew they were true. "What now?" he asked. "How do I fix this? How do I go back to being who I was?" Marina smiled through her tears. "I think you've already started, Dad. When you stopped to see Isabella, when you stood up for her, when you went to her home to meet Ms. Carmen, those are the actions of the man I knew as a child, the father I love and miss." Father and daughter hugged right there in the cafe, crying together, releasing years of hurt and distance. It was the beginning of a reconnection they both desperately needed. In the days that followed, Marina became deeply involved in the mission to help Isabella and Ms. Carmen. As a psychologist with experience working with vulnerable children, she had knowledge and connections that Edward lacked. It was Marina who suggested they start by getting official documents for Isabella, which was essential for enrolling her in school and ensuring she had access to basic health care. "We need to do this the right way, Dad," Marina explained as they drove together for another visit to the family. "It's not just about giving them money and solving everything with financial power. It's about empowering them, giving them the tools to build their own lives with dignity." Edward absorbed every word like a dedicated student. He was learning that wealth and power, things he had always considered the solutions to everything, were actually just small parts of a much more complex equation. It was during this process that an unexpected revelation occurred. Marina was helping to organize the few papers Ms. Carmen had when she found an old photograph. It was of a young Ms. Carmen, maybe in her early 20s, holding a baby. On the back was written a name and a date. "Ms. Carmen," Marina asked carefully, "who is this baby in the photo?" Ms. Carmen's face clouded over, as it always did when painful subjects from the past were brought up. "That's my oldest daughter, Lucy. We had a falling out many years ago. I don't even know where she is today." Edward, who was sitting nearby, felt a pang in his chest. He knew all too well the pain of separated families, of broken relationships. Why did you fight, if it's not too invasive to ask? Ms. Carmen sighed deeply. Lucy was always different from the other two. She wanted more out of life, you know. She studied hard, got a scholarship to a good university, but when she graduated, she sort of became ashamed of where she came from. She stopped visiting, said I was a reminder of a past she wanted to forget. The last time I saw her was almost 10 years ago when she came to tell me she was getting married, and that it was better if I didn't come to the wedding because I would embarrass her in front of the important people who would be there. The silence that followed was heavy. Isabella, who was playing in the corner with the doll Edward had bought for her, didn't even look up, but it was clear she already knew the story. Marina looked at her father, and they were both thinking the same thing. How many people did exactly what Ms. Carmen's daughter had done? How many people, upon moving up in the world, simply discarded where they came from, were ashamed of their roots, treated their humble origins as a flaw to be hidden? Edward remembered doing the exact same thing. After becoming wealthy, he rarely spoke of his own difficult childhood, about growing up in a poor family, about how his father worked 16-hour days in a factory. It was as if, by accumulating wealth, he had erased that part of his history, replacing it with a more palatable narrative of hard work and individual merit, without mentioning the sacrifices of others, the luck of being in the right place at the right time, the privileges that even in poverty he had had for being a white man. Miss Carmen, Edward said softly, if you'd like, I can try to find your daughter. I have resources, people who can do searches, not to force anything, but just so you know she's okay, where she is. Miss Carmen looked at Edward for a long moment. I don't know if I want to know, Mr. Edward. It hurts too much. But maybe, she hesitated, maybe it's time to at least try to make peace. Not for me, but for Isabella. This girl deserves to know. Some family, even if it's a distant aunt. Marina came over and held Miss Carmen's hand. I'll help with that, Miss Carmen, carefully and respectfully, and we'll only make contact if we think it's safe and healthy for everyone. Thus began a search that would lead to one of the biggest twists in the entire story. Marina, using her contacts in social work and with the help of a private investigator hired by Edward, managed to locate Lucy in less than 2 weeks. She lived in a wealthy neighborhood on the Upper East Side, was married to a successful lawyer, had 2 children, and worked as a human resources manager at a large tech company. Her name was now Lucy Miller Davis. She had taken her husband's last name and had apparently built a life completely disconnected from her origins. Marina discovered that Lucy was active on social media, posting photos of international trips, dinners at expensive restaurants, and sophisticated social events. There was not a single mention of her mother or the neighborhood where she grew up. Marina debated at length with Edward about how to approach Lucy. We can't just show up at her house, Marina argued. That could be counterproductive. We need a careful approach. Edward agreed, but he also felt a growing sense of urgency. Ms. Carmen was getting weaker. Her swollen legs weren't improving, and despite the best doctors Edward had hired, it was clear she needed more intensive and constant care. Time, they knew, was precious. It was Isabella who inadvertently provided the solution. One afternoon, while drawing with crayons Marina had bought, she said, Miss Carmen always says everyone deserves a second chance to do the right thing, even people who made big mistakes. Those simple words, spoken with the unconscious wisdom of children, resonated with Marina and Edward. A second chance, that's what everyone needed. Lucy needed a second chance to honor her mother. Ms. Carmen needed a second chance to have a daughter in her life. And Edward, he realized, was getting his second chance to be truly human, to use his resources for something that really mattered. Marina decided to write a letter, not a cold, formal letter, but an honest one, telling the story of Isabella, of how Miss Carmen had taken her in despite having no resources, of how this extraordinary woman continued to give love, even when life had only given her reasons to harden her heart. The letter didn't accuse, didn't blame. It just told the truth and offered an invitation to meet the incredible person her mother still was and the special girl she was raising. The letter was sent by mail, addressed personally to Lucy. And then they waited. Days passed with no response. A week. 2 weeks. Miss Carmen pretended not to care, But Isabella noticed she looked out the window more often, as if waiting for someone who never came. It was on a rainy afternoon in November, almost a month after the letter was sent, that the response came, but not in the way they expected. Lucy didn't write back. She just showed up. Edward and Marina were visiting Ms. Carmen and Isabella when they heard a hesitant knock on the wooden door. Isabella ran to open it and was met by an elegant woman in her early 40s, wearing expensive clothes but with eyes red and swollen from crying. "I'm looking for Carmen Santos," the woman said in a trembling voice. Ms. Carmen got up from the bed with difficulty, leaning against the wall. When she saw who was at the door, all the color drained from her face. "Lucy," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "Mom," Lucy said, and then she broke down. She fell to her knees right there in the doorway of the apartment, sobbing with an intensity that seemed to tear her apart. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything, for abandoning you, for being ashamed of you, for being so cruel. I got the letter, and I couldn't live with myself anymore knowing you were here, going through all this while I pretend I don't have a mother." Ms. Carmen, with tears streaming down her face, limped to her daughter and knelt beside her, ignoring the pain in her legs. The two of them hugged there on the floor, crying together, releasing years of hurt, rejection, longing, and repressed love. Edward, Marina, and Isabella watched in silence, all with tears in their eyes. The moment was too sacred to be interrupted with words. When they finally calmed down, Lucy came inside and sat next to her mother on the bed. In a still shaky voice, she told her story. She spoke of how shame had consumed her, how she had tried to build a completely new identity, how she had lied to her husband and children about her origins. But Marina's letter had broken down all the false barriers she had built. "I read that letter over 100 times," Lucy said. "Every word was a stab to my heart, because I realized that while I was spending fortunes on useless things, pretending to be someone I'm not, my mother, this incredible woman, was here giving love to an abandoned child, even though she had nothing. You are 100 times a better person than I will ever be." Ms. Carmen held her daughter's face in her hands. "You don't have to be better than anyone, my child. You just have to be true, and you're here now. That's what matters." Lucy looked at Isabella, who was watching her with curiosity. "Is this Isabella?" she asked. Ms. Carmen nodded. "Yes, my granddaughter of the heart." Lucy knelt in front of Isabella. "Hi, Isabella. I'm Lucy, Ms. Carmen's daughter. You are a very lucky girl to have someone like her taking care of you." Isabella tilted her head, thinking, "I know. Ms. Carmen is the best person in the world. Even when she's in pain, she always smiles at me." That brutal innocence made Lucy start crying again. Edward, who had remained silent until then, approached. "Lucy," he said gently, "I'm Edward Price. I was the one who hired the person who wrote the letter. I want you to know it wasn't to judge you or make you feel bad. It was because your mother is an extraordinary person and deserved to have her daughter back in her life." Lucy looked at Edward, recognizing the name. "I know who you are. My husband has done business with your hotels, and I know you didn't have to do any of this. Thank you. Truly, you gave me a chance to fix the biggest mistake of my life." In the days following that emotional reunion, everyone's life changed again. Lucy took on the responsibility of caring for her mother, taking her to the best doctors, arranging for proper treatments. She also insisted on moving Ms. Carmen and Isabella to a better house, even offering to have them live with her. But Ms. Carmen, with her characteristic dignity, refused. "I don't want to be a burden, my child. I want to remain as independent as I can." It was Edward who found the perfect solution. He bought a simple but comfortable house, still in the same neighborhood where Ms. Carmen had always lived, near the neighbors she knew and loved. It was a house with 3 bedrooms, a proper bathroom, a spacious kitchen, and a small but cozy backyard. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a real home, adapted to the needs of Ms. Carmen and Isabella. And now, with Lucy back in their lives, it was a home full of family, forgiveness, and second chances. 3 months had passed since that rainy day, when Lucy reappeared in Ms. Carmen's life. 3 months that transformed not only the lives of Isabella and Ms. Carmen, but of everyone who had been touched by this story that began with a simple request to use a bathroom. Isabella was now attending a public school near her home. Marina had managed to get all the necessary paperwork and enrolled the girl in an institution that, while not elite, had dedicated teachers and a welcoming environment. For the first time in her life, Isabella wore a clean school uniform, carried a new backpack full of notebooks and colored pencils, and was learning to read and write. Her teacher, Ms. Marion, a 50-year-old woman with a true calling for teaching, was enchanted with the girl and constantly reported to Edward and Marina about Isabella's extraordinary progress. "She has a thirst for learning that I rarely see," Ms. Marion said in a meeting with Edward and Marina. "It's as if she's making up for lost time. And you know what's most beautiful? She's generous with the other children, always helping those who are struggling, sharing her snack. This girl has a heart of gold." Edward listened to these reports with a pride he had never felt even with his own business successes. Watching Isabella flourish, gaining weight, smiling more, dreaming about the future, was a reward that no financial profit could ever match. Ms. Carmen, for her part, was in much better health. The proper treatments, the regular and nutritious food, and especially the happiness of having her daughter back in her life had worked a remarkable transformation. Her legs still swelled, but less frequently and intensely. She could walk better, and had even returned to her crafts, now not out of desperate need for survival, but for pleasure and as a form of therapy. Lucy visited her mother almost every day, sometimes with her children, who had fallen in love with the grandmother they had just met. But the most profound transformations happened in Edward. Those months had been a journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. He hadn't completely returned to business as usual. Oh, he still ran his hotel empire, but now with a completely different perspective. Edward began to implement radical changes in his companies. He created a scholarship program for employees' children. He established partnerships with organizations that worked with the homeless population, offering real employment opportunities with proper training and living wages. He opened the doors of one of his hotels for community workshops where people like Ms. Carmen could learn new skills and sell their products with a fair profit margin. His executives initially reacted with skepticism. "Mr. Price," one of them argued in a meeting, "these initiatives will decrease our profitability. The investors won't like it." Edward looked at the executive with a firmness that left no room for discussion. "Then we will educate the investors on what really matters. A company cannot be successful by building its success on the exploitation and exclusion of vulnerable people. We are going to do this the right way, and if some investors don't like it, they are free to leave." Surprisingly, or perhaps not, most of the investors didn't leave. Some even became enthusiastic about the new initiatives, realizing there was immense brand value in being a truly socially responsible company, not just in empty marketing campaigns. Marina had also undergone significant changes. Her relationship with her father, once distant and full of unresolved hurts, was now one of true partnership and friendship. They worked together on various social projects, combining Edward's financial resources with Marina's psychological and social expertise. She had even convinced her father to fund the expansion of the NGO where she worked, allowing them to serve 3 times as many children. And Robert, the manager of Elegance Boulevard. His story had also taken an unexpected turn. After the confrontation with Edward, he had indeed undergone intensive training on diversity, inclusion, and empathy, paid for by the store's parent company. But more than that, something inside him had changed. The humiliation of being publicly confronted, combined with Edward's example of how to use privilege for good, had planted a seed. Robert began to question his own attitudes and prejudices. He realized he had spent years building barriers, excluding people, judging superficially, all in the name of maintaining a standard that, he now understood, was cruel and empty. He resigned from the luxury store, and with the help of a surprising letter of recommendation from Edward, got a job at a non-profit organization that distributed clothes and hygiene products to people experiencing homelessness. "It's not about easy redemption," Robert told Edward over coffee months later. I know I can't erase what I did to Isabella or to all the other people I treated poorly over the years, but I can try to do differently from now on. I can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Edward appreciated the honesty of those words. He too was learning that real change wasn't about perfection, but about a continuous commitment to do better. It was on a February afternoon, with the strong sun characteristic of a New York thaw, that everyone gathered for a special celebration. Isabella was turning 6, and for the first time in her life she was having a real birthday party. The party was at Ms. Carmen's new house, the backyard decorated with colorful balloons and a table laden with sweets, snacks, and a huge chocolate cake, Isabella's favorite. Present were Ms. Carmen, Lucy, with her husband and 2 children, Edward and Marina, Robert, who had become an unexpected friend of the family, Ms. Marion, the teacher, John from the cafe where it all began, Sandra, the brave saleswoman who had been promoted, and several neighbors who had always helped Ms. Carmen in the tough times. Isabella wore a new dress, pink as she had always dreamed, and had a princess tiara on her head that Marina had bought. Her face shone with pure happiness as she ran around the yard playing with the other children, laughing loudly, with no trace of the scared, humiliated girl Edward had found months ago. At one point, Edward found himself alone for a few moments, observing the whole scene. He thought about the man he was just a few months ago, cold, distant, driven only by profit and power. He thought about how he could have easily ignored Isabella that day in the store, gone back to the fitting room, continued trying on clothes, lived his life of privilege without questioning anything. An entire life, he murmured to himself, can change because of a single moment of choice. Marina approached and stood beside her father. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked softly. Edward smiled, a genuine smile full of emotion. "I'm more than okay, Marina. I'm happy, truly happy. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I feel like my life has real meaning." Marina hugged her father. "You know Mom would be so proud of you right now, don't you? She always said that underneath all that tough businessman armor, there was a man with a huge heart. She was right." Edward felt tears burn his eyes at the mention of Beatrice. His wife had always tried to show him there were more important things than money, but he had been too stubborn, too blind to see. "I wish she were here to see this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She is," Marina replied with certainty. "Somehow, she is." Miss Carmen approached the two, limping slightly, but with a radiant smile on her face. "Mr. Edward, Marina, come with me. I want to show you something." They followed her inside the house, where Miss Carmen led them to a small altar she had set up in a corner of the living room. There were old photos, candles, flowers. In the center was the photo of Beatrice that Edward had given her, along with photos of other people who had passed on. "I pray for her every day," Miss Carmen said, "for your wife, Mr. Edward. I thank her for raising such a wonderful daughter like Marina, and I ask that she continue to guide you on this path of kindness you've chosen to follow." Edward couldn't hold back. His tears. He knelt before the altar and cried, releasing years of repressed pain, guilt, regrets, and finally, acceptance. Marina and Miss Carmen stood by his side, supporting him in silence. When he composed himself, Miss Carmen held his face in her calloused hands. "You are a good man, Mr. Edward. You always were. You were just lost. But Isabella found you, or maybe you found her, and you saved each other. That's a miracle." At that moment, Isabella ran into the house looking for Edward. "Uncle Edward, Uncle Edward!" she shouted excitedly. That was the nickname she had given him, and he got emotional every time he heard it. "Come see, John from the cafe brought a huge cake with candles. You have to sing Happy Birthday with me." Edward wiped his tears and smiled. "I'm coming, Princess. You deserve the biggest happy birthday anyone has ever sung." They returned to the yard where everyone was gathered around the table with the cake. The candles were lit, 6 small ones, plus a larger one in the center. Everyone began to sing, and Isabella closed her eyes tightly, making her wish before blowing out the candles in one go. Later, while they were eating cake and talking, someone asked Isabella what she had wished for. The girl thought for a moment before answering with the characteristic honesty of children. I wished that everyone in the world could have a family that loves them, even if it's not a blood family, because Ms. Carmen taught me that family is who takes care of you and who you take care of back. The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Many of those present discreetly wiped away tears. This 6-year-old child who had been humiliated, rejected, and forgotten by society was teaching everyone a profound lesson about love, belonging, and community. Edward looked around, seeing all these people who in some way had been touched and transformed by Isabella. Robert, who had learned about empathy. Sandra, who had learned about courage. Lucy, who had learned about forgiveness and honesty. Marina, who had reconnected with her father. John, who had learned that small gestures of kindness could have immeasurable impacts. And he himself, Edward, who had learned that true success wasn't measured in money but in lives touched, in differences made, in love shared. As the party was ending and people began to leave, Edward asked for everyone's attention. He had something important to say. "I wanted to thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice firm but full of emotion. "This party is to celebrate Isabella's birthday, but for me, it's also a celebration of transformation. A few months ago, I was dead inside, even without knowing it. I had everything money could buy, but I had nothing that truly mattered. And then I met a 5-year-old girl who just wanted to use a bathroom, and she completely changed my life." He paused, looking at Isabella, who was watching him with her big, expressive eyes. "Isabella taught me that dignity has no price, that every human being deserves respect, that small acts of kindness can change the world. She taught me that I needed to wake up, to stop pretending I didn't see the suffering around me, to stop hiding behind my privilege." Edward turned to Miss Carmen. "And this extraordinary woman taught me about unconditional love, about giving even when you have nothing, about dignity in the face of adversity. Ms. Carmen, you are one of the richest people I have ever met, not in money but in everything that truly matters." Finally, he looked at Marina. "And my daughter taught me that it's never too late to start over, to mend broken relationships, to be the person you really want to be." Edward took a deep breath before making his announcement. "For that reason, I have decided to create a foundation. It will be called the Isabella Foundation, in honor of the girl who changed everything. The goal is to ensure that other children like Isabella, other families like Ms. Carmen's, have access to decent housing, quality education, proper health care, and most importantly, are treated with the respect and dignity that every human being deserves. Marina will be the president of the foundation, and I will dedicate a significant portion of my company's profits to fund it permanently." There was a moment of shocked silence, and then enthusiastic applause echoed through the yard. Isabella, not fully understanding what it meant but sensing it was important, ran to Edward and hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Uncle Edward, for everything." Edward hugged her back, feeling tears run freely down his face. "No, Isabella, thank you for saving me when I didn't even know I needed to be saved." As the sun set over New York, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, that diverse group of people remained in the yard, talking, laughing, planning the future. They were people from completely different backgrounds who would never have met under normal circumstances, but who were now united by something stronger than any social or economic difference. They were united by love, a shared purpose, and the fundamental belief that every human life has immense value. Months later, the Isabella Foundation was operating at full capacity. They had helped over 100 families secure decent housing, enrolled 200 children in schools, and provided medical treatment for dozens of people who lacked access to basic health care. But more than numbers, they had changed narratives. They had shown that it was possible to use wealth and privilege in a way that truly made a difference, not through condescending charity, but through genuine empowerment and respect for human dignity. Edward frequently visited the families the foundation helped. He made it a point to know every story, every face, every dream. He was no longer a distant businessman practicing charity from afar. He was a human being connected to other human beings, learning as much as he taught, receiving as much as he gave. Isabella continued to grow, flourishing in ways that moved everyone who knew her. She was one of the top students in her class, dreaming of becoming a teacher when she grew up so she could help other children like her. Miss Carmen, with her health stabilized and her heart at peace, said she had lived long enough to see miracles happen. Lucy, finally honest about her origins, discovered that the people who truly mattered respected her more, not less, for her journey, and Marina found in the foundation the purpose she had always sought, combining her passion for helping people with resources that allowed her to make real, lasting differences. A year after that fateful day in the store, Edward was giving a lecture at a university on corporate social responsibility. At the end, a young student raised his hand and asked, "Mr. Price, aren't you afraid that your humanitarian practices will negatively affect your profits?" Edward smiled, remembering when he himself would have asked that same question. "You know," he replied, "there was a time when I would have measured success exclusively by profits. But I met a 5-year-old girl who taught me that true success is measured by the positive impact we have on the lives of others. My hotels are still profitable, perhaps even more so than before, because people want to be associated with companies that do good. But even if it did affect the profits, I wouldn't change a thing, because I finally understood that the purpose of life isn't to accumulate wealth, it's to use what we have to make the world a little better for everyone." That night, Edward returned home and found a text from Isabella, now 7 and learning, to write messages on the simple phone Marina had given her. The message read, "Uncle Edward, today in school I told my story to the class. The teacher said it's important to tell stories of hope. Thank you for being part of my story of hope." Edward read and reread the message, his heart overflowing with gratitude. He replied, "Thank you, Princess, for being part of my story of transformation. You taught me that it's never too late to wake up, to see, to make a difference. I love you very much." And it was true. Of all the accomplishments in his life, all the successful deals, all the awards and recognitions, nothing compared to the gift Isabella had given him, the chance to become human again, to truly feel, to be part of something bigger than himself. The story that began with humiliation and tears ended with transformation and hope. It proved that a single moment of choice, a single decision to see instead of ignore, to act instead of stand by, could create waves of change that reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Isabella, the girl who just wanted to use a bathroom, had become the catalyst for a quiet revolution of empathy and humanity. And Edward, the businessman who had lost his soul on the way to the top, had found it again in the most unlikely of places, in the eyes of a child whom society had discarded, but who refused to be invisible. In the end, it wasn't Edward who saved Isabella, it was Isabella who saved Edward, and together they proved that when we choose to see the humanity in one another, when we decide that dignity is a universal right and not a privilege, when we use our resources and positions not to elevate ourselves above others, but to lift others up with us, we can create transformations that echo forever. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Isabella, Edward, and Ms. Carmen has touched your heart deeply. If you are moved by this journey of transformation, humility, and love, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it Edward's confrontation in the store, Ms. Carmen's reunion with her daughter, or perhaps the pure wisdom of Isabella that taught great lessons to all the adults around her? Every day we bring intense and true stories like this one, revealing the deepest and most beautiful side of the human soul, showing that small gestures can create great transformations. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of empathy and kindness. We'll see you in the next episode with more stories that will touch your heart and make you reflect on what really matters in life. See you soon.